Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano, and I got a very important episode lined up for you today. Before I get into it, make sure that you follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the PAS Report website, pasreport.com, and share this episode with others, with family, friends, put it on social media. We got to inform people about the issues that impact our great nation. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure that you are following the podcast and that it's sending downloads. Apple did an update, and so the downloads aren't coming through. I've gotten several complaints, so just double check that. But we have to understand that we are in a precarious situation because from the halls of Washington to the far reaches of the world, this administration's lack of leadership has sent shockwaves through the international community. And I always say that when it comes to the global arena, it's not complicated. It's a game of high-stakes chess. Unfortunately, this administration is playing checkers, and we're getting outmaneuvered by everyone, our adversaries, our allies. But when it comes to our adversaries, they're making bold strategic moves, and they're not even hesitating anymore. It shows how little respect they have. They operate without any fear of consequences. And this administration, they sit by, they twiddle their thumbs, they want a virtue signal, and they think they're much smarter than everyone else, but we are reaching a level where there's going to be no turning back soon. And I don't think that this administration has the smarts or the wit to recalibrate their foreign policy approach, because one thing is abundantly clear. The Biden administration's failed leadership, it's become the catalyst for the dangerous trends that we're witnessing throughout the world. And if we take a hard look at the Biden administration and their approach to foreign policy, we see from the Middle East to Eastern Europe, maybe Central Europe, I'll speak about that in a minute, Asia, Latin America, the consequences of this failed leadership, they're reverberating globally. The United States is significantly weaker today than it was just 3 years ago. And our adversaries sense little fear of any type of real repercussions from this administration. The administration projects weakness onto the world stage. And you don't want weakness on the world stage. You want resolute toughness. That's what you want. When foreign leaders don't respect our president of the United States, when they don't believe or fear an American president, the implications are far-reaching, and the clock is ticking. Stakes couldn't be higher. Throughout history, we've seen how strong and decisive leadership can shape the course of nations. Just think back. Think back to George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Harry Truman, Ronald Reagan, Donald Trump, so many other presidents. And conversely, weak leaders, ineffective leaders, weak leadership provides instability. It creates instability. Just think of Benjamin Harrison, James Buchanan, Andrew Johnson, Jimmy Carter, and obviously the current president of the United States. Today, I'm going to explain the lack of leadership from this current administration, how it's provided fertile ground for our adversaries to operate with impunity, and how this is now threatening worldwide stability and future security. I want to look at some of the key decisions that have paved the way for situations that were totally avoidable. I mean, if you've been listening to this podcast, there were things I warned about in March of 2021. I mean, these things were avoidable, and yet now we find ourselves in these problems. The complexities of global power dynamics are on full display, and the implications for our future security, our standing on the world stage, are at stake. It's not just about geopolitical power plays that are currently underway. It's about how these missteps have eroded trust among our allies, how they've undermined America's standing on the world stage, and how it's going to be really difficult to repair that standing. You know, Mr. Magoo has been slow-walking us into the major world conflict. There's no denying that. The only thing that may be unfair of what I just said is it may be unfair to Mr. Magoo. Let's be honest here. President Biden, he's not the one making the decisions. This is a culmination of decades of failed foreign policy makers, of people that have been in the bureaucracy for 20 and 30 years, of the war hawks that are greedy, that have these egos, and their hubris has pushed us to this brink. The failures are so obvious, that you would think that they would recognize them. However, their egos have blinded them. And that's why they're not reversing course. When it comes to international politics, every move matters. Every decision carries weight. And I want to talk about the realities of the challenges that we're going to face, all because of this failed leadership. The dangers that exist out there. It's time we ask tough questions. It's time we introduce accountability in the system. We challenge the status quo and really truly look at the state of affairs under the Biden administration. Now, before I get into it, I want to briefly mention and give kudos to federal judge Anna Reyes. Last week, she called out the Biden Department of Justice for their blatant hypocrisy. To me, it's criminal hypocrisy, but whatever, that's just me. And you have the Department of Justice under Attorney General Merrick Garland, who have defied congressional subpoenas. Now, the DOJ has been instructing officials not to comply with congressional subpoenas from Jim Jordan and Congressman Comer. And the judge has had enough. She called out the DOJ for throwing people in prison for doing that exact same thing. She specifically brought up Peter Navarro's case, where he is currently serving a 4-month prison bid. And I want to just quote her quickly. She said, quote, "There's a person in jail right now because you all brought a criminal lawsuit against him because he did not appear for a House subpoena. And now you guys are flouting those subpoenas? I find it rich that you pursue criminal action and put people in jail for defying congressional subpoenas, then say this here. You all are making a bunch of arguments that you would never accept from any other litigant. Are you kidding me?" That was refreshing to hear. The amazing part is that Judge Reyes is a Biden appointee. Now, it's not that she's just going to, give in and do whatever the House wants, but the fact that we have an example like this makes me optimistic. We still have some people within the bureaucracy that could put ideology aside and just do the right thing. I'm not asking for conservatives or Republicans to get special treatment. I just want one standard for everyone, including government officials, including bureaucrats. If ordinary people could go to jail for defying a congressional subpoena, then so should government officials. It's as simple as that. It's not complicated. It's not partisan. And I wanted to highlight this because it is important, and it's not receiving enough coverage. But examples like these can serve as a hopeful sign going forward. Let's hope it continues. Now, I'm going to take a quick break. When I get back, I'm going to break down the global landscape, what's going on in the international arena, and how this administration is a complete failure. So everyone hang tight. I'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So I want to start off with the whole Russian invasion of Ukraine because we're in a situation that was totally avoidable. If you were listening to this podcast in March of 2021, you would know that I warned that Russia was going to look to invade Ukraine if this administration projected weakness. If all the signs were there, it was clear as day what was going to take place. You had Russia amassing troops on the Ukrainian border. You don't just move 90,000 something troops and build out barracks, build out, mobile hospitals, move military vehicles and assets into place, have to bring out munition stockpiles, train the troops while they're there. That's not a cheap endeavor. It costs millions upon millions of dollars to do something like that over the course of a month. And so why was Putin investing all that money to do this? Then what really caught my eye was when they did a training exercise with Belarus. And it's not uncommon for nations to do military joint exercises together. However, what made this interesting was the fact that when the exercise was over, Russia just left all its equipment on the northern border of Ukraine. Okay, now you don't go with another country, do a military training exercise, and then leave your equipment there. So something was going on. It was obvious. There were warning signs. Then in December, you have Biden come out and state, well, if it's a small incursion in Ukraine, we might be able to talk about that. But anything other than that, though, it's going to be a problem. So we saw this fecklessness, and there were a lot of people encouraging sanctions prior to the invasion. The Biden administration said, no, we'll put them on if an invasion takes place. Totally avoidable. But there was no leadership, and that's the key thing. However, I want to play a clip from Senator Chuck Schumer because it really reveals what ghouls these people really are, how people like Senator Schumer, and it's not just Democrats. I'm not putting this all on Democrats' back. There are plenty of Republicans that are neocons, the war hawks out there that want to fund the military-industrial beast. They love it. And so here, take a listen to Senator Schumer, and then I'll come back with my analysis.
As the Congress gavels back into session, I also urge Speaker Johnson and House Republicans to snap out of their paralysis and pass the Senate's National Security Supplemental. The situation in Ukraine is desperate. Speaker Johnson has now sat on his hands for 55 days, as the National Security Supplemental has collected dust in the House. That's 55 days of America standing on the sidelines while our friends in Ukraine fight and die on the battlefield with no support. 55 days of our European allies wondering when the U.S. will step up. And with each passing day, Ukraine continues to run out of more ammo, continues to run out of soldiers, and continues to run out of hope that can successfully expel the Russians from their borders. And let's be blunt, the biggest reason Ukraine is losing the war is because the hard right in the Congress has paralyzed the United States from acting. That's it. That's the reason. Speaker Johnson has to decide for himself whether or not he will do the right thing for Ukraine, for America, and for democracy, or if he'll allow MAGA Republicans to hand Vladimir Putin a large victory. I'm confident that if the Speaker puts the Senate's National Security Supplemental on the floor, it will pass. It remains the best, quickest, and most realistic way to get Ukraine the help it needs. So again, there is a lot that the Senate must do in the coming weeks and months, and to get anything done will require bipartisan cooperation. I thank my colleagues for their good work so far in 2024 and look forward to working with all of them to keep delivering for the American people. Now,
so it's clear the Ukraine campaign is not doing well. You have Senator Schumer out there saying that the biggest reason Ukraine is losing this war is because the hard right in Congress has paralyzed the United States from acting. And that's just simply a lie. Again, just go back to all the podcast episodes I did on this. What we are witnessing was totally predictable. Again, this isn't rocket science, people. It's not. And no, Senator Schumer, the biggest reason Ukraine is losing the war is because American policymakers, American officials were arrogant. And they let their egos and virtue signaling dictate the policy. They think they're so much smarter than everyone else. But just look at the timeline. So the invasion took place at the end of February 2022. Okay, again, it was avoidable. We didn't have to be in this position. We could have prevented Russia from invading in the first place. But you have these idiots that are just feckless. They don't know how to use American power. They don't know how to use America's dominance on the world stage. And when you have President Biden walk out there and tell people it's acceptable for a small incursion, this is what you get. But regardless of that, so February 2022, we see the invasion. May 2022, there's an agreement in place. Now, it would have been smart if the United States, so when Russia first invaded Ukraine, it was a disaster for Russia. There was no doubt that it was a disaster. You had the sanctions go on Russia that hurt their economy. You prevented them from pushing oil and natural gas. And Russia's economy heavily relies on that income, that revenue it receives from its oil and natural gas sales. Russia was losing on parts of the battlefield. They were getting decimated. And you had Ukraine that was succeeding. So that would have been time to push a negotiated truce. That would have been time to force an agreement on the two sides. An agreement was being worked on, but not by the United States. Again, the lack of leadership. Other countries were working on this agreement, Turkey, France. In any event, the deal was ready to go. You had both Zelensky and Putin agree to it. All we needed was to get the American president and this administration on board. And it would have been a win-win for us had we done that. We would have had a severely weakened adversary in Russia. We also would have had a Ukraine whose policies we get to control given the amount of money and military equipment we provided. And this was a pretty decent agreement. Sure, Ukraine would have to state unequivocally that it would not seek to join NATO, but this agreement stated that they would be allowed to seek security guarantees from other countries, including the United States. So we would have a Ukraine that we could dictate policy to. You would have a weakened adversary. Over 500,000 Russians and Ukrainians would be alive today, but the DC elites got greedy. They wanted more war. And their hubris is why Ukraine is losing this war now. If we would have forced a settlement then, we would have been in a good position now. There would be much more stability in the world. Instead, we allowed Russia time to adapt to the battlefield. And that's what normally happens in war. If you go in and you start failing off the bat, well, you recalibrate, you see the failures, and then you make strategic corrections. And that's exactly what Russia did. It was always known that Russia was the stronger, more dominant country than the Ukraine. There's nothing in the world that's going to change that. It always was. And Russia doesn't care how many bodies they have to put in front of this thing. Putin knows if he loses this campaign, it means his life. In Russia, there's actual accountability. If you fail, you will die as president. And so he had everything to lose. Now, if he signed on to this agreement and we pushed it through, if we forced it, He could have went back and said, hey, we got what we wanted. Ukraine's not going to join NATO. We have Crimea. It's now internationally recognized we have Crimea. And so it's a win for us. He could have played it off. But we gave Russia time. Russia recalibrated. Now they're actually strategic victories all over the place on the battlefield. They keep pushing forward. Ukraine's getting decimated. So Senator Schumer, it's actually your fault that Ukraine is losing this war. It's the defense industrial complex fault that pushed for more war, more aid, more military munitions. It's the Biden administration's fault for several reasons. One, not explaining why this would be important to us and why the American people should support it. Remember, when it's a president of the United States, it's incumbent on them to persuade the American people. Going out there simply saying it's in our interest, that doesn't cut it. That's not going to persuade people, especially when people see billions of dollars being transferred overseas as their livelihoods have become much more difficult, as they're struggling to pay their bills. So you have to explain to Americans why it's important to sacrifice this, but they never did. They just said, you either support it or you push Russian propaganda and we'll censor you. That was the messaging. You either support it or you're a Putin apologist. That's how juvenile these morons are. And then you look at our failed foreign policymakers that still have the old Cold War mentality. So if we look at Russia today, Russia's actually more powerful today than it was prior to February of 2022. If you look at it, Russia's making battlefield advances. Russia's selling more oil and natural gas than ever before. And they're not just selling it to America's people like, oh, well, that's because China's buying it up. You have this alliance between China and Russia. No, that's not the case. You have Japan buying the Russian oil and gas. You have South Korea buying it. These are American allies. You have India buying it. So no, that's not the case. It's not all China. Sure, China's buying a lot, but it's not the only one. But what's even more terrifying, what's even more frightening is Secretary Blinken and his proclamation. So the new Biden administration policy going forward, that's even more frightening. Take a listen to what Secretary Blinken had to say.
Ukraine, the determination of every country represented here at NATO remains rock solid. We will do everything that we can. Allies will do everything that they can to ensure that Ukraine has what it needs to continue to deal with Russia's ongoing aggression against Ukraine, an aggression that gets worse with every passing day. Ukraine will become a member of NATO. Our purpose at the summit is to help build a bridge to that membership. And to create a clear pathway for Ukraine moving forward.
But, of course, we believe that Ukraine deserves to be a member of NATO and that this should happen sooner rather than later.
So according to Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who gets his orders from the chief diplomat of the United States, the president of the United States, or whoever the president's handlers are, because, again, they're the ones making decisions, now they're actually promoting the idea that Ukraine is going to be part of NATO and that they're going to do everything in their power to push this. You also had the Polish president or prime minister talk about the same thing. This is insane. If they are successful in this endeavor and Ukraine becomes a NATO member, that immediately thrusts us into World War III. Article 5 would be immediately invoked. And that would mean that all countries in Europe, all 32 nations involved in the NATO alliance, particularly the United States, would then have to send troops to defend Ukraine, immediately sparking World War III. This is friggin' insane. And these are the people running our country. So they strengthen Russia, let it become much more stronger, and now we say that, well, we're going to let Ukraine into NATO. We're going to push for Ukrainian NATO membership. These people are juveniles. They have no clue. They think that they could control everything. But they don't realize that everything spiraled out of their control, that they cannot control their situation any longer. And the more they push, the more likely it's going to result in a major failure that's going to be catastrophic, not just for us in the United States, but for the entire global community. Everything this administration touches, every single adversary they engage with, those adversaries get stronger. Just look at it. Russia is more powerful today because of the failed administration, but it's not just them, because this is the MO of the Biden administration. You also have the Taliban that's more powerful today than it was prior to when we first invaded in 2001. Now, that's not all on the back of the Biden administration. There was 4 administrations throughout Afghanistan. It was a disaster. But There is a lot on Biden's back. Look at Iran. Look at China. Look at Brazil. Much more powerful today than they were prior to Biden taking office. And I'm going to talk about those countries when we get back from this quick break. Welcome back, everyone. So now I want to turn our attention first to East Asia and South America, because there's a nexus there that where countries are working together. And then I'll look at the Middle East real quick. So when it comes to the idea of China, we've seen China grow much more aggressive in the South China Seas. We've seen China grow much more aggressive towards places like Taiwan, countries like the Philippines. And China is seeking dominance in the Pacific. There is zero doubt about it. China is now ready to challenge the United States on a world stage. And so they are doing everything they can to undermine American power and influence throughout the world. We've allowed them to pretty much capture large parts of Africa through their investments, Southeast Asia, South Asia. You look at the Belt and Road Initiative, and South America, where you have them building out military bases. But Brazil is an interesting case, because I think Brazil epitomizes this failed administration. When we look at what's taking place in Brazil, it's disgraceful what the Lula regime is doing. Disgraceful. How the Lula regime is undermining American policy all over the world. Now, who does Brazil owe a lot of money to? Well, a lot of their debt is held by China. So the question becomes, are they doing the bidding of China? But here's the kicker. This administration worked hard to oust Bolsonaro from power, to get Lula elected, to make Lula the leader of the country. And as soon as Lula gets into office, what does he do? Well, he turns around and he sticks it to the United States. He wants to undermine our currency. He's calling for the BRIC nations to adopt a new worldwide currency reserve, which would destroy the American economy. I mean, the one thing that keeps us afloat right now is the dollar's dominance. And yet Lula's undermining this one thing. You have the Lula regime bashing the United States publicly while praising our adversaries and moving closer to their sphere of influence. You have the Lula regime that's now targeting Bolsonaro and political opposition in his country. Similar to that over here, right? I mean, Bolsonaro is getting arrested because he had a fake COVID vaccine passport. Are you friggin' kidding me? Are you kidding me? That's what you're going to take him down for? You have him being investigated because he created an insurrection after the Brazilian election. And then now you have Brazil that's targeting X, Elon Musk and X. Why is he targeting it? Well, because of misinformation and disinformation. That's why the Brazilian government wants to target it, because only government can put out the narrative. That's similar to every single dictatorial regime. All these authoritarians, they want to control the flow of information because they understand that if they control the flow of information, they control the people. They control what people see, what people could say, how people think, the opinions they form. So only the government narrative is acceptable. So now they're targeting Elon Musk. And this is all the doing of our current administration. And Bolsonaro warned before he left office. He warned about China's influence inside Brazil. He explained that the Biden administration is pushing Brazil into China's corner because it's ignoring Brazil. And now we see that's exactly what happened. Truly stunning. This is in our own backyard. If you go to Mexico, you have President Obrador, who's blaming the fentanyl crisis, the overdoses here in the United States on Americans. It's not the fault of the Mexican government that's allowing these cartels to operate with impunity, that allowing these cartels to freely move their poison around the world and across our border. He blames us for the human trafficking. He blames us for the millions of people that are crossing through his territory to illegally enter the United States. And where's the Biden administration? Where are they? Where's their response? Why don't they recall the Mexican ambassador immediately to send a message to the Mexican government? Why don't they summon the Mexican ambassador here in the United States? Take him to task. Tell him what President of Mexico is saying is unacceptable. That if Mexico wanted to, they could stop the immigration flow. All they have to do is control their side of the border. All they have to do is control their southern border. Mexican immigration laws are pretty damn strict. But when it's a pathway, a pipeline up to here in the United States, Mexican officials don't care. And so you have them taking advantage of us. And in fact, he says that in order to stem all these problems, that the United States should give all these different countries, billions upon billions of dollars more than we already give them in the first place. Our tax dollars at work, funding these governments to the tune of billions of dollars. And for what? What are the results? More corruption? More of those in power fattening their pockets as people suffer? Truly stunning. But this administration is so feckless, they won't confront these governments. There is no Ronald Reagan. There is no President Trump. Instead, the Biden administration bows to any country that dares speak ill of the United States. Any country that dares to criticize the United States, he bows to them rather than standing up for the United States. What kind of leadership is that? We still are the sole superpower of the world, yet we don't wield our power the way it's supposed to be wielded. You have this administration, President Trump alienated us from the international world stage. No, the world respected us. Yeah, Trump may have been an a-hole in a lot of ways. Almost said it. I didn't. I almost did. But sometimes you want an a-hole as president. See, the good thing about the former president was he understood human behavior. He understood how these leaders act around the world. He understood that the leaders of other countries are going to push for what's in their nation's best interest, even if it means undermining what's in our best interest. And so he pushed back against it. People criticize former Trump's foreign policy, but at least it was a different foreign policy than what we've witnessed over the last 30 years. And for our allies may not have liked the former president. They didn't like the way he behaved. They mocked him. They tried to ridicule him. But they did what he wanted, right? He warned about Germany's reliance on Russian natural gas. He warned about it. He called Germany out. Said, get the gas from us. Why don't you get it from a friendly ally? He criticized the European nations for not putting up their 2% requirement of GDP towards defense under the NATO treaty obligation. And so what did nations have to start doing? Well, they had to start kicking in more. He put the world on notice. Not that he was an isolationist and he was looking to isolate America, but that he was going to be putting America first. And then you have this administration come in and it seems they're putting everyone else first. How many billions did he release to Iran? So now let's move to the Middle East. Iran has been emboldened over the last several years. Emboldened. They've received all this money. You have the Biden administration begging them to return to a nuclear agreement that was never going to work in the first place. It was a failed agreement to begin with. You have the Biden administration that just a month ago, President Biden said, well, you killed a couple of our troops or contractors over in Jordan through your proxy groups, and now you're going to face the wrath. You're going to feel the consequences of that. What did he do? He launched off a couple of missiles, hitting the rebel groups, as if Iran cares that members of these proxy groups died, as if Iran has any regard for human life when it comes to their proxy groups. He didn't target any key military assets. Instead of Israel taking out the general, we should have taken out the general. As a message to Iran, you kill an American troop, we're going to kill a top-level official on your part. You might not want to do that. Instead, you have Israel that takes out a general, and now Iran's threatening a response. See, you have to understand the mindset of these foreign leaders. If the Ayatollah feared that the United States was going to back Israel and that there would be severe consequences if Iran launches a counterstrike after the general was killed, the Ayatollah would step down. But they have no fear of the president, and you have this president and his administration throwing Israel overboard. Again, it's disgraceful, and yet we see it. And so now the Iranian Ayatollah is looking at it that Israel's on their own, that they're isolated. Maybe Israel announcing that it's stopping operations right now in Gaza, maybe it's because they are preparing for an Iranian counterstrike, because the Iranians have no fear of President Biden or his administration. This is the stupidity that we have to deal with. But the problem is that it has real-world implications. It has real-world consequences. And sooner or later, we're going to get sucked into this vortex, and it's not going to end well. Rather than have Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, this administration has adopted the diplomacy of Neville Chamberlain. It's insane. We're seeing history repeat itself. And sooner or later, something bad's going to happen. That's why I want them to reverse course, but they're not going to. And I think that's the terrifying part, because they do believe that they are smart. They do believe that they are the moral holy warriors, and they do want to reshape the world. But their version of reshaping the world is going to destroy Western civilization. We've already seen the decline significantly over the last few years, and it's only going to get worse. So people better wake up out there to the realities of what's going on in the international arena. Things may be tens of thousands of miles away, but they do impact us here at home, and it's not going to be a pretty sight if this powder keg explodes. Now, if you found the content of this episode informative, please leave the P.A.S. report a 5-star rating. Take 30 seconds to write a review on any podcast platform that allows it. Also, share this episode with your family and friends and on social media. Quick note, I will be on Gutfeld on April 16th, so You're going to want to tune into that. I'm sure it'll be great. Have no idea what the segments are yet, but Gutfeld is a great show to be on with great people. So check it out, and I'll be back next week with another great episode of the PAS Report Podcast.
Thank you for listening to the PAS Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASReport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.